The champagne glasses sparkled in the afternoon sun as Margaret Wellington led 50 VIP guests through the pristine backyard toward what she promised would be the crown jewel of her exclusive HOA charity gala. Her heels clicked confidently on the stone pathway as she gestured grandly toward the pool area, her voice carrying over the murmur of anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to be amazed by our stunning centerpiece, but as the privacy fence gate swung open, her triumphant smile froze. Where crystal-clear water should have reflected the azure sky, there was nothing but cracked concrete and dead leaves. The silence stretched like a taut wire as 50 pairs of eyes turned from the empty hole to Margaret's horror-stricken face. Behind the crowd, hidden in his kitchen window, David Chen allowed himself the smallest of smiles as he watched 3 months of careful planning reach its perfect crescendo. Part 1. The ultimatum. David Chen had been quietly tending his garden. When Margaret Wellington's shadow fell across his prized tomato plants, he looked up from his pruning shears to find the HOA president standing at his back gate. Clipboard in hand, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair catching the morning sunlight like a helmet of judgment. "David, we need to discuss your pool," she announced without preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for what she considered the lesser homeowners in Millbrook Estates. David straightened slowly, wiping soil from his hands on his gardening apron. At 62, he'd learned to recognize trouble when it wore designer sunglasses and carried a laminated rulebook. "Good morning to you too, Margaret. What about my pool?" Margaret's lips pursed as she consulted her clipboard with theatrical importance. "The annual Millbrook Charity Gala is in 3 months. The HOA board has voted to utilize your pool area as the centerpiece venue for our most prestigious event of the year," voted. David's eyebrows rose. "Shouldn't the pool owner have a say in that vote? Your attendance at HOA meetings has been sporadic," Margaret replied with a dismissive wave. "Those who choose not to participate in community governance forfeit their right to complain about community decisions." David felt the familiar knot of frustration tighten in his chest. Ever since Margaret had assumed the HOA presidency 2 years ago, Millbrook Estates had transformed from a quiet neighborhood into her personal kingdom. Property values had risen, certainly, but so had the endless stream of rules, assessments, and community initiatives that always seemed to benefit Margaret's social standing more than the actual community. "I never said you could use my pool," David said carefully. Margaret's smile sharpened like a blade. "According to Section 4.7 of the HOA covenant which you signed when you purchased your home, the HOA reserves the right to utilize private amenities for community events when deemed necessary for the greater good of the neighborhood." David had read every word of that covenant when his wife Alina was still alive. They'd laughed about the more ridiculous clauses over coffee at their kitchen table, never imagining someone would actually try to enforce them. That clause refers to emergency situations. A charity gala hardly qualifies as an emergency. The Millbrook Children's Foundation Gala raises over $50,000 annually for underprivileged youth. Margaret's voice rose with righteous indignation. "If you're opposing charity work, Mr. Chen, perhaps you should reconsider your priorities." The manipulation was as smooth as it was predictable. David had seen Margaret deploy this same tactic at HOA meetings, frame any opposition as selfishness or moral failing. Half the neighborhood had fallen for it, too intimidated or too busy to push back against her increasingly autocratic rule. "I'm not opposing charity, Margaret, I'm opposing the assumption that my private property is yours to commandeer." Margaret's expression hardened. "Your pool is the only one in the neighborhood large enough and appropriately positioned for our needs. Henderson's pool is too small. The Johnsons has that unsightly hot tub, and the Garcia's landscaping is entirely inadequate for a high-end event. Then rent a venue like every other organization. The entire point is to showcase Millbrook Estates to potential residents and donors. Your backyard offers the perfect combination of privacy, elegance, and space. The stone patio, the mature oak trees, the view of the hills, it's exactly what we need to make the right impression." David glanced at the pool area she was describing. With such proprietary confidence, he and Alina had spent 15 years creating this space, hand-selecting every plant, personally laying the stonework, transforming what had been a bare lot into something beautiful. Alina had hosted their grandchildren's birthday parties here, their anniversary celebrations, quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers. Even now, 3 years after her death, he could still see her floating on her back in the deep end, eyes closed against the summer sun. "The answer is no, Margaret." Margaret's facade of pleasantness evaporated entirely. "I was hoping we could handle this amicably, David, but if you insist on being difficult, I have other options." She flipped through several pages on her clipboard with aggressive precision. "Let's see. Your fence height violates the current standard by 3 inches. Your mailbox paint doesn't match the approved color palette established last year. Your driveway has several cracks that constitute a neighborhood aesthetic violation. And don't get me started on that vegetable garden. The current landscaping guidelines clearly state that front-facing garden areas must be ornamental, not functional." David stared at her in disbelief. You're threatening to fine me into compliance. I'm offering you a choice. Allow the HOA to use your pool for one evening with full cleanup and restoration. Guaranteed or face a comprehensive property inspection that will likely result in several $1,000s in violation, fees and mandatory corrections. The threat hung between them like a poison cloud. David knew Margaret had the power to make good on every word. The HOA's legal authority was ironclad, their fining structure aggressive, and their enforcement selective but absolute. He'd watched them systematically harass the elderly Mrs. Patterson over her bird feeders until she'd finally sold her home and moved to a retirement community. He'd seen them force the young couple on Maple Street to replant their entire front yard because the flowering bushes were too exotic for the neighborhood's established character. You have until the end of the week to decide, Margaret continued, her voice returning to its artificially sweet register. The event is scheduled for the third Saturday in September. We'll need access to your backyard for setup beginning the Wednesday prior. She turned to leave, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. Oh, and David, the guests will include several prominent real estate developers and city council members. People who could make life very difficult for residents who aren't community-minded. The threat was crystal clear. Comply or face consequences that extended far beyond HOA fines. David watched her stride away, her heels clicking against the pavement with military precision. Through his kitchen window, he could see her stopping at other houses, clipboard in hand. No doubt recruiting support for her latest campaign or identifying her next target. He walked back to his tomato plants, but his hands were shaking too badly to continue pruning. Elena's voice seemed to whisper through the rustling leaves. Don't let her win. David, don't let her take this away too. That evening, David sat in his living room with Elena's old legal books spread across the coffee table. She'd been a family law attorney, meticulous and thorough, and she'd taught him to read contracts like a chess player reads the board, always looking 3 moves ahead. By midnight, he'd found what he was looking for, buried in subsection 12.4 of the HOA's Maintenance and Utilities Covenant. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Margaret Wellington had made one crucial mistake in her ultimatum. She assumed David Chen was just another frightened homeowner who would fold under pressure. She had no idea she was dealing with a man who had nothing left to lose and 15 years of loving maintenance records to prove it. The next morning, David made 3 phone calls. The first was to Morrison Pool Services to schedule an emergency repair consultation. The second was to his insurance company to file a routine maintenance claim. The third was to his lawyer, Elena, old partner, who listened to David's explanation with growing amusement. It's legally airtight, confirmed Attorney Harrison over the phone. If the pool requires maintenance that renders it unusable, the HOA can't compel you to provide access to a non-functional amenity. And the timing. Entirely coincidental. As far as anyone can prove, pools require regular maintenance. Systems fail. These things happen. David hung up and walked to his backyard, where his beautiful pool sparkled in the morning sunlight. Crystal clear water, reflecting the sky like a mirror. By the time Margaret Wellington arrived with her 50 VIP guests, it would tell a very different story. Justice, David had learned, sometimes required patience, but revenge could be scheduled with precision timing. 3 months, that's how long Margaret had given him to prepare. It was going to be more than enough. Margaret Wellington stood in her pristine kitchen, surveying the catering menu with the focused intensity of a general planning a military campaign. 57 RSVPs for the Millbrook Charity Gala, including Mayor Patricia Hernandez, 3 city council members, and the CEO of Pinnacle Development Group. This wasn't just a fundraiser, it was Margaret's debut on the regional social scene. Her chance to prove that Millbrook Estates could compete with the exclusive communities in the hills. The pool area will be absolutely stunning, she told her reflection in the granite countertop, practicing her presentation voice. Floating candles, string lights in the oak trees, a champagne fountain positioned right at the shallow end, ... Her phone buzzed with a text from her event coordinator. Final headcount needed by tomorrow, confirming Chen pool access. Margaret's smile was predatory. She'd driven past David's house twice this week, noting with satisfaction that his mailbox remained the wrong shade of white and his driveway cracks had actually spread. The man was practically begging for a citation blitz. She scrolled through her contacts and found David's number. David, it's Margaret Wellington. I trust you've made the right decision about the pool. There was a pause on the other end, then David's measured voice. I've been thinking about what you said. Excellent, I knew you'd see reason. The setup crew will need access Wednesday morning at 8 sharp. I'll have the key coded added too. I didn't say yes, Margaret. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Excuse me, I said, I've been thinking. About community spirit, about charity, about what Elena would have wanted. The mention of his dead wife caught Margaret off guard. She'd expected defiance or capitulation, not sentiment. Elena was a lovely woman. I'm sure she would have supported the Children's Foundation. She would have. That's why I'm writing a personal check for $5,000 directly to the charity. Margaret blinked. It was more than most attendees donated at the actual event. That's very generous, David, but it doesn't solve our venue situation. No, it doesn't, because I'm still not letting you use my pool. The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone, fury building like pressure in a kettle. David Chen had just cost her the perfect venue, embarrassed her in front of her event coordinator, and potentially sabotaged the entire gala. The Hendersons' pool was too small for the floating arrangements. The community center was booked, and renting an off-site venue would destroy the exclusive neighborhood appeal she'd been marketing to her VIP guests. She speed-dialed Janet Morrison, her most reliable HOA board ally. Janet, I need an emergency property inspection on David Chen. Full compliance review. I want every violation documented and processed immediately. Margaret, isn't that a bit? The man is actively sabotaging a charity event. If he wants to be difficult, we'll give him difficult. 2 hours later, Margaret stood in David's front yard with Janet Morrison and HOA treasurer Bob Wilkins, clipboards in hand, photographing every potential violation with the thoroughness of crime scene. Investigators, fence height exceeds current standard by 4 inches, Janet noted, measuring with a collapsible ruler. Mailbox color is off specification, Bob added, comparing David's white paint to an official color card. And look at this driveway, Margaret pointed to the hairline cracks with satisfaction. Clear deterioration of neighborhood aesthetic standards. David emerged from his house as they were photographing his vegetable garden. He looked calm, almost amused, which only intensified Margaret's irritation. Afternoon, neighbors, he said pleasantly, enjoying the tour. Official HOA business. Margaret replied curtly. Multiple violations require documentation. Of course they do. David's smile was infuriating in its serenity. Janet, Bob, I hope you're getting good photos. Documentation is so important for legal proceedings. Something in his tone made Margaret pause. Legal proceedings. Well, selective enforcement of HOA rules can be considered harassment under state law. I'm sure my attorney will want to review your inspection records for the entire neighborhood. You know, to ensure these same standards are being applied equally to all residents. Margaret felt a cold prickle of unease. She glanced at Janet, whose expression had shifted from confident to worried. The truth was, their enforcement had been anything but equal. Margaret's closest allies had never faced inspections despite obvious violations, while residents who crossed her found themselves drowning in citations. We inspect all properties regularly, Margaret lied smoothly. I'm sure you do. I look forward to seeing those comprehensive records. David's eyes glinted with something Margaret couldn't quite identify. Have a wonderful afternoon, folks. Don't let me keep you from your community service. He disappeared back into his house, leaving the 3 board members standing awkwardly. In his front yard, maybe we should, Janet began. Document everything. Margaret cut her off. I want this filed by tomorrow. But as they walked back to their cars, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that David Chen knew something she didn't. That evening, Margaret was startled by her doorbell. She opened it to find Tommy Morrison, Janet's teenage son, holding an envelope. Mrs. Wellington, my mom asked me to give you this. Margaret tore open the envelope to find Janet's resignation letter from the HOA board, effective immediately. The reason cited was concerns about board governance and potential legal liability. Her phone rang before she could fully process the resignation. Bob Wilkins sounded nervous and distant. Margaret, I've been thinking about this Chen situation. Maybe we should reconsider the inspection. I mean, if he's talking about lawyers, Bob, we have absolute authority to enforce community standards. Do we? Because I looked up that harassment statute he mentioned, and Margaret, if a court decides we've been targeting specific residents while ignoring violations elsewhere, we could face serious consequences. Personal liability, not just HOA liability. Margaret felt the first crack in her confidence. You're overreacting, am I? When's the last time we inspected the Hendersons' property? Or the Garcias? Hell, when's the last time we measured your fence height? Margaret? The line went dead. Margaret poured herself a large glass of wine and tried to salvage her evening, but her mind kept returning to David's unnaturally calm demeanor. It was the composure of someone holding all the cards, not someone facing thousands in violation fees. 3 days later, the official violation notices were delivered to David's mailbox. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as he collected his mail, expecting to see some reaction: anger, defeat, panic. Instead, David simply nodded to himself and walked back inside. Her phone rang within the hour. Margaret Wellington. The voice was crisp, professional. This is Attorney Harrison from Harrison & Associates. I represent David Chen regarding the violation notices issued by your HOA board. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. I'm not authorized to discuss HOA legal matters. Of course not. That would be your board president's responsibility, which, according to our records, is you. What do you want? Mr. Chen has asked me to inform you that he'll be filing a formal complaint with the State HOA Oversight Board regarding selective enforcement practices. Additionally, we'll be requesting a full audit of your board's inspection records for the past 2 years. Margaret sank into a kitchen chair. That's completely unnecessary. We're simply enforcing existing covenants. I'm sure you are. The audit will make that clear. Oh, and Mrs. Wellington. Mr. Chen wanted me to mention that his pool maintenance company will be performing emergency repairs starting next week. System failure. Apparently, quite unfortunate. Timing with your event approaching. The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her mind racing. System failure. Emergency repairs. The timing couldn't be coincidental, but how could she prove it? She called Morrison Pool Services, the company that maintained half the pools in Millbrook Estates. Hi, this is Margaret Wellington with the Millbrook HOA. I understand you're doing emergency work on the Chen property. That's right, the technician replied. Major system failure. Gonna take at least 2 weeks to get the parts and complete the repairs, possibly longer if we run into complications. System failure? What kind of system failure? Pool pump seized. Filtration system backed up. Chemical balance is completely shot. Honestly, it's impressive the whole thing held together as long as it did. Mr. Chen said he's been hearing strange noises for months but kept putting off the repair. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. Months, yeah. He's got maintenance logs going back 15 years. Very detailed records. Shows exactly when problems started developing. Guy's been meticulous about documentation. 15 years of maintenance records. Strange noises for months. Emergency repairs, scheduled with perfect timing to coincide with her event. Margaret hung up and walked to her living room window, which offered a clear view of David's backyard. His pool sparkled in the afternoon sun, looking absolutely pristine. For now, her phone buzzed with another text from her event coordinator. Need to confirm venue by Friday or we'll have to move to the community center. Please advise. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the weight of 3 months of planning, dozens of high-profile invitations, and her reputation as Millbrook's social leader crashing down around her. David Chen had just checkmated her with. The morning of Margaret's charity gala dawned with crystalline clarity, the kind of perfect September day that made Millbrook Estates look like a magazine cover. David Chen stood in his kitchen, sipping coffee and watching the catering trucks arrive at the community center 3 blocks away. Margaret's hastily arranged backup venue. His phone buzzed with a text from Attorney Harrison. City inspector found no violations. Anonymous complaint dismissed. Well played. David smiled. Margaret's desperate gambit with code enforcement had been predictable. What she didn't know was that David had already had his property inspected by the city 6 months ago. Shortly after Elena's death, when he'd been considering selling, every system, every structure, every detail had been brought up to current code as part of his grief-driven need to perfect something, anything, in a world that had suddenly become imperfect. The real surprise had come yesterday, when Margaret's own neighbors started calling. David, this is Susan Henderson. I heard about what Margaret tried to do with your pool, and I wanted you to know she's been threatening us too. Susan's voice had been tight with anger. She told Bill that if we didn't donate at least $1,000 to her charity, she'd find violations in our landscaping. We're scared. David, can your lawyer help us? 3 more calls had followed. The Garcias, the Johnsons, even elderly Mr. Patterson from Elm Street, all with similar stories of Margaret's escalating threats and selective enforcement. She'd been running Millbrook Estates like a protection racket, and David's stand had given others the courage to speak up. Now, watching the activity at the community center, David felt a familiar ache in his chest. Elena would have loved this moment, not for the revenge, but for the community finally standing together against a bully. His doorbell rang at exactly 10 a.m. David opened it to find Margaret Wellington on his doorstep. Her usual composure cracked like old paint. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect hair slightly disheveled, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd been awake all night. David, we need to talk, of course. Come in. Margaret stepped into his living room, her gaze immediately drawn to the wall of photos documenting his and Elena's life together. Her expression softened slightly before hardening again. The community center is a disaster, she said without preamble. The acoustics are terrible, the lighting is harsh, and the whole space smells like gymnasium floor wax. My guests are going to think I'm a joke. I'm sorry to hear that. How can I help? Margaret's laugh was bitter. You can stop pretending this is coincidence. Your pool's emergency maintenance happened to coincide perfectly with my event. Your lawyer just happened to mention selective enforcement right when I was documenting violations. And somehow, every one of your neighbors just happened to develop the spine to complain about my leadership all in the same week. David sat down in his favorite armchair, the one he'd shared with Elena during their evening conversations. Margaret, I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm implying that you orchestrated this entire situation to destroy my reputation. Did I? Or did you destroy your own reputation by threatening and bullying everyone in the neighborhood until they finally had enough? Margaret's composure cracked further. You don't understand what I've done for this community. When I took over as HOA president, property values were stagnant. Crime was rising. The neighborhood was becoming ordinary. I changed all that. By terrorizing your neighbors. By setting standards. By demanding excellence. By making Millbrook Estates a place people are proud to live. David studied her face, seeing past the anger to the desperation beneath. Margaret, why is this so important to you? Really, for a moment, her mask slipped entirely. Because I've spent my entire adult life trying to prove I belong somewhere. Do you know what it's like to grow up poor, to claw your way into circles where everyone else was born? To know that one mistake, one moment of looking less than perfect, and they'll all remember exactly where you came from. The vulnerability in her voice caught David off guard. He'd expected more threats, more manipulation. Instead, he was seeing a woman whose entire identity was built on the precarious foundation of other people's approval. Alina grew up poor, too, he said quietly. Single mother, 3 jobs, scholarship to law school. She never forgot where she came from, but she never let it define her worth either. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She immediately blinked away. Alina was different. She was genuinely good. I'm good at pretending to be good. You could be genuinely good. You could use your energy to actually help people instead of controlling them. It's too late for that. Margaret's voice hardened again. Half the neighborhood hates me now, thanks to you. The other half thinks I'm weak. And after today's disaster, I'll be lucky if I can get elected to the gardening committee. David stood up and walked to his kitchen window, which offered a perfect view of his backyard. The pool sparkled in the morning sun, crystal clear and pristine. Margaret followed his gaze, and her expression shifted from resignation to confused. Suspicion and David. Your pool isn't under repair. No, it's not. But Morrison Pool Services said. I never called Morrison Pool Services. Margaret stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. You lied. You made up the whole emergency repair story. I never lied. I hired Aquatic Systems Maintenance, a different company entirely, to perform routine maintenance on my pool. They drained it, cleaned it, and refilled it yesterday afternoon. The work was completed exactly as scheduled. But the system failure was a hypothetical scenario I discussed with my lawyer 3 months ago. What would happen if my pool became temporarily unusable right before your event? Would the HOA have any legal recourse? The answer, as it turns out, is no. Margaret's face cycled through confusion, realization, and finally, grudging admiration. You never intended to sabotage my event. On the contrary, I spent 3 months planning exactly how to sabotage your event. I researched every legal angle, documented every threat you made, and prepared contingencies for every possible response. I was ready to drain my pool, claim system failure, and watch your gala collapse into chaos. Then why didn't you? David turned back to face her, his expression serious. Because Alina would have been ashamed of me. She taught me that the measure of a person isn't how they treat their enemies. It's how they treat their enemies when they have the power to destroy them. Margaret sank into the couch, her head in her hands. So you're not going to sabotage my event? No, but I'm also not going to let you use my pool. Then what happens now? The community center is a disaster. Half my board has resigned. The entire neighborhood thinks I'm a tyrant. And I still have 50 VIP guests arriving in 6 hours expecting the social event of the season. David was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Elena's voice in the garden, of the community that had rallied around him, of the woman sitting in his living room who'd built her entire identity on a foundation of fear and control. There is another option, he said finally. Margaret looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. You could tell the truth. What? Tell your guests exactly what happened, that you made a mistake, that you overreached, and that you're learning from it. Use the community center. Embrace the imperfection. Focus on the charity instead of the spectacle. Margaret stared at him as if he'd suggested she perform naked interpretive dance. I can't do that. These people expect perfection. They expect exclusivity, they expect authenticity. And if they don't, then they're not the kind of people whose approval you should be seeking anyway. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at the photos on David's wall. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. Then maybe it's time to learn. David walked to his desk and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote quickly, tore off the check, and handed it to Margaret. She looked down at the amount and gasped. $10,000. For the Children's Foundation, Alina would have wanted me to support the actual cause, not the social theater around it. Margaret stared at the check, then at David. Why are you doing this? Because 3 months ago, you threatened to destroy my life over a pool. Today, I have the power to destroy yours over the same pool, and I'm choosing not to use it. But everyone will think that you're a human being who made mistakes and learned from them. And if they can't handle that level of honesty, then they weren't really your friends anyway. Margaret stood up slowly, clutching the check. I need to go set up for the gala. Yes, you do. She walked to the door, then turned back. David, thank you for showing me who I don't want to be anymore. Thank you for showing me who I still want to be. After she left, David walked to his backyard and sat by the pool, watching the afternoon light dance on the water. He could hear the sounds of setup at the community center, voices calling directions, equipment being moved, the controlled chaos of an event coming together. That evening, he received a text from Susan Henderson, went to the gala. Margaret's speech was amazing. She apologized to everyone, donated her own money to the charity, and promised to resign from the HOA board. Half the audience was crying, the other half was applauding. Best charity event we've ever had. David smiled and deleted the mess.